The geopolitical framework of the Baltic region during the first half of the 20th century was shaped by a complex interplay of imperial legacies, national ambitions, and competing ideologies. Estonia, having declared its independence from Russia in 1918 during the chaos of the Russian Civil War and the collapse of the German Empire, found itself in a precarious position between two expansive powers, the Soviet Union to the east and Germany to the west. Though internationally recognized as a sovereign state in 1920, Estonia's independence was fragile, hinging on broader European stability that would soon unravel. Throughout the interwar period, the Estonian Republic pursued policies of neutrality and defensive autonomy, maintaining a modest army and investing in fortifications like the Vindloo coastal defenses. However, with the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August 1939, Estonia's fate was sealed without consultation. In the secret protocols of this Nazi-Soviet non-aggression agreement, the Baltic states were divided into Soviet and German spheres of influence. Estonia fell under Soviet dominion, and the Red Army swiftly demanded military bases on Estonian soil. By June 1940, under intense pressure and veiled threats, the Estonian government capitulated to Soviet demands. Within weeks, the country was fully occupied by Soviet forces, its political institutions dismantled, and Estonia was annexed into the USSR as the Estonian Soviet Socialist Republic. This transition, though formally legal in Soviet terms, was characterized by repression, nationalization of private property, and the liquidation or deportation of thousands of Estonian officials, intellectuals, and officers. The NKVD conducted mass arrests during the summer and autumn of 1940. According to Estonian estimates, at least 8,000 people were detained in the first year of occupation. On the 14th of June 1941, in the notorious June deportation, approximately 1,000 Estonians were forcibly removed from their homes and transported to Siberia and other remote parts of the USSR. Many perished en route or in exile. The trauma from this single event would cast a long shadow on the national scene. Meanwhile, the local population responded with a mix of fear, resignation, and underground resistance. Former members of the Estonian Defense League and nationalist groups began forming clandestine networks, anticipating that a wider conflict might offer a chance for liberation. Their hopes were realized, though in a complicated form, in June 1941, when Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. As the German Wehrmacht advanced eastward, many Estonians initially greeted them as liberators from Soviet rule. Local uprisings broke out in several regions even before German forces arrived, with the Forest Brothers and other partisans attacking retreating Red Army units and Soviet collaborators. By the end of July 1941, Estonia was under German occupation, and the Third Reich began to integrate the territory into its military and administrative structure. The shift from Soviet to German control did not bring true independence. Estonia was designated as part of Reichskommissariat Ostland and governed as a German colony with limited local autonomy. However, for many Estonians, especially those with anti-Soviet or nationalist leanings, the German occupation presented a lesser evil and a potential vehicle for restoring autonomy through cooperation. It is in this environment that thousands of Estonian men chose to volunteer for German military service. Motivations varied: revenge for Soviet atrocities, survival under occupation, ideological alignment, or hopes of securing future independence. Among them were individuals like the subject of this documentary, a volunteer whose decision to wear the uniform of the enemy of his occupiers would later place him directly in Stalin's crosshairs. His story, while unique in its survival, reflects a broader phenomenon: the tragic position of small nations and individuals trapped between totalitarian powers, compelled to choose sides not by loyalty, but by geography and historical circumstance. To understand the path that led to such choices, we must first examine the early military dynamics of the German advance, the role of local volunteers and auxiliary units, and how Nazi policy evolved in the Baltic region. The story of one Estonian man thus becomes a lens through which we view the great upheavals of Eastern Europe, a story framed by occupation, forced alliances, shifting fronts, and the eventual return of Soviet vengeance. When the German invasion of the Soviet Union commenced in June 1941, Estonia found itself rapidly engulfed in the advance of Army Group North. Within mere weeks, Soviet forces began retreating eastward, abandoning territory as the Wehrmacht and its auxiliary collaborators closed in. Estonian nationalist elements, previously repressed under the Soviet regime, now emerged in open revolt. Armed bands of forest brothers, operating in rural regions, disrupted Soviet withdrawal and targeted NKVD officers and collaborators, contributing to the swift collapse of Soviet authority in the region. By early July 1941, German units, primarily elements of the 18th Army and Panzer Group 4, entered Estonian towns and cities, greeted by local populations hopeful for deliverance from Soviet terror. Tallinn, the capital, fell in late August after a brief siege and naval evacuation. In the wake of the German advance, a provisional Estonian National Committee attempted to declare restored independence, but the Germans quickly dissolved it, establishing their own occupation administration. The German military command initially employed Estonians in support roles, guard units, interpreters, drivers, but by late 1941, as the war's scope expanded, recruitment of volunteers into armed formations began in earnest. The Omakaitse, a reconstituted version of the pre-war Estonian Home Guard, served under German oversight, performing security tasks, policing duties, and anti-partisan actions in rural districts. However, this was only a precursor to more direct military integration. By 1942, Germany began forming Estonian auxiliary police battalions, Schutzmannschaft, later deploying them to frontline duties in Belarus and Ukraine, where they operated under SS command. Though technically volunteers, many enlisted under pressure or in hope of avoiding deportation to forced labor camps. Others saw service as a chance to resist Bolshevism or to protect their homeland from future reoccupation. These motivations, while diverse, were shaped by immediate survival, geopolitical ambiguity, and the absence of viable alternatives. Among those who joined was a young Estonian farmer's son from Tartu County. Having lost several family members in the 1941 Soviet deportations, his decision was deeply personal. He enlisted in a local police battalion and was sent to Ukraine in 1942, participating in rear area security operations near Kharkiv and Dnipropetrovsk. His unit, like many others, was tasked with combating partisans, protecting supply lines, and performing occupation duties, tasks which often led to moral compromises and controversial actions, especially as the lines between anti-partisan warfare and reprisals against civilians blurred. As German casualties mounted on the Eastern Front, especially after Stalingrad, the Waffen-SS began expanding its recruitment efforts across occupied Europe. Estonia, seen as a reliable source of anti-Soviet manpower, was targeted for inclusion. In early 1943, Heinrich Himmler authorized the formation of a full Estonian SS division. By spring, volunteers and conscripts were absorbed into the newly formed 20th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, 1st Estonian, trained in Neuhammer, Germany, and later deployed to the Eastern Front. The farmer's son transferred into this new unit, trained under German officers, but organized with Estonian cadre. Despite its SS designation, the division was composed mostly of nationalists and anti-communists with limited ideological alignment to Nazism. Their goal, often stated, was to defend Estonia from future Soviet occupation, not to support the broader goals of the Third Reich. Nevertheless, their service placed them under SS command and within the structures of a regime responsible for systemic atrocities. By late 1943, the 20th Estonian Division was positioned near Nevel in northern Russia. There, it participated in defensive operations against Soviet offensives, fighting alongside Latvian and German formations in freezing conditions and dense forests. While regarded by German command as disciplined and effective, the division suffered heavy losses and endured severe logistical shortages. The front lines shifted back and forth, and morale fluctuated. But Estonian soldiers held firm, motivated not by ideology, but by a desperate hope that German victory might forestall a second Soviet occupation. Back home, meanwhile, life under German rule proved disillusioning. The anticipated restoration of independence never materialized. Cultural institutions were censored, forced labor escalated, and Jewish and Roma populations were systematically exterminated with the participation of local collaborators. Food shortages, repression, and war fatigue spread across the countryside, eroding public support for the occupiers. Still, the looming fear of Soviet return kept many Estonians aligned with Germany by default rather than conviction. The volunteer from Tartu County, like many others, now found himself locked in a war he did not start, fighting under a banner not his own, against an enemy he dreaded, but all within a context that denied him any real agency. As the Red Army prepared its major offensives for 1944, his fate, and that of thousands of Estonian volunteers, would soon be sealed by the tides of geopolitics beyond their control. In early 1944, the strategic landscape on the Eastern Front shifted decisively against Germany. After the catastrophic defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk, Soviet forces launched a series of coordinated winter offensives aimed at recapturing lost territory and penetrating deep into Eastern Europe. For Estonia, this marked the beginning of a second major occupation threat within 3 years. The Leningrad-Novgorod offensive, launched in January, broke the siege of Leningrad and rapidly pushed German forces westward. By February, Red Army units approached the eastern borders of Estonia. In response, the German High Command declared Estonia part of its Ostwall defensive zone, a buffer intended to halt the Soviet advance toward the Baltic Sea. Hitler demanded that the Baltics be held at all costs, fearing that their loss would sever Army Group North from the rest of the Wehrmacht and open the path to East Prussia. Estonia, therefore, became the scene of strategic entrenchment and desperate defense. Reinforcements were rushed in, including the 20th Waffen-Grenadier Division of the SS, 1st Estonian, which had just been reorganized and re-equipped after its losses near Nevel. For the Estonian volunteers, the moment was decisive. Many who had joined to fight Bolshevism now faced the prospect of defending their actual homeland. This shift was reflected in propaganda, as the German administration allowed limited nationalist rhetoric to rally public support. General mobilization was declared in February 1944, conscripting all able-bodied Estonian men born between 1904 and 1923. The measure resulted in over 38,000 men being called to service, some joining German units, others forming new Estonian formations under German control. The returning volunteer from Tartu County, now a non-commissioned officer, was redeployed to the Narva front. There, the Estonian SS division was integrated into the 3rd Germanic SS Panzer Corps, commanded by Felix Steiner. The Narva River line, stretching from the Gulf of Finland to Lake Peipus, became the centerpiece of the German effort to contain the Soviet advance into Estonia. The terrain favored defense, swamps, forests, and frozen rivers, allowing smaller forces to delay larger Soviet formations. From February to July 1944, the Battle of Narva raged with exceptional intensity. Soviet forces, led by the Leningrad Front under Marshal Govorov, committed over 12,000 troops, supported by artillery, armor, and air power, in successive attempts to break the line. Facing them were approximately 6,000 defenders, including German SS units, Estonian volunteers, Latvian battalions, and remnants of other Axis formations. The Estonian division played a central role in holding key positions, especially around the town of Narva and the strategic Tannenberg line. Casualties mounted rapidly. In the first months alone, German and Estonian defenders suffered at least 23,000 losses, while Soviet casualties likely exceeded 45,000. The front stagnated into trench warfare, with artillery duels, minefields, and night raids. Estonian units, despite being under German command, fought with the conviction that their country's fate hung in the balance. Many believed that a prolonged defense might create conditions for Western intervention or delay Soviet reoccupation until the end of the war. Yet, the political realities contradicted such hopes. At the Tehran Conference in late 1943, Allied leaders had already recognized the Soviet Union's right to re-establish control over the Baltic states. No diplomatic support was forthcoming for Estonian independence. Despite local resistance and defensive success, the geopolitical outcome was predetermined. Meanwhile, internal divisions widened. In Tallinn, underground resistance groups debated whether collaboration with Germany had compromised the goal of independence. Some advocated for a unilateral declaration of sovereignty, while others feared such a move would provoke Soviet reprisals. Civilian life in Estonia during early 1944 was marked by tension, with increasing Allied air raids, food shortages, and the ever-present threat of frontline collapse. In June, the Red Army launched a new offensive aimed at cutting off Army Group North. While Narva held temporarily, Soviet breakthroughs in neighboring Latvia and Belarus threatened to outflank the defenders. The German command began planning a gradual withdrawal, identifying fallback lines in southern Estonia and Livonia. For the Estonian SS division, this meant the possibility of abandoning their homeland entirely, something many were unwilling to accept. Among them, the NCO from Tartu faced a personal dilemma. His village lay directly in the path of the expected Soviet advance. Letters from home, smuggled through military channels, told of evacuations, arrests, and rumors of Soviet cleansing lists targeting former collaborators and volunteers. He requested leave to escort his family to safety, but was denied. The front was under too much pressure, and every man was needed. By late July, the Narva front finally gave way. Soviet troops breached the Tannenberg Line, and German units began withdrawing westward. The Estonian SS division, reduced in strength but still operational, conducted rear-guard actions to delay pursuit. Many Estonian civilians, fearing Soviet return, fled with the retreating forces, some to Germany, others to neutral Sweden by boat. The Estonian volunteer, refusing evacuation, remained with his unit as it was redeployed to southern Estonia for a final stand. As Soviet forces crossed the Emajõgi River and pushed toward Tartu, the last hope of preventing reoccupation faded. By September, the Red Army had recaptured most of the country. The German command ordered a full evacuation, and the 20th Estonian Division was pulled back to Courland and later to Silesia. What followed for those who stayed behind would mark the beginning of Stalin's revenge. The NKVD began mass arrests within days of Soviet re-entry, targeting anyone suspected of collaboration. Volunteers, conscripts, political figures, and even their families were rounded up, interrogated, and deported. For the returning Estonian soldier, the path of exile, survival, or capture would soon unfold, and each route carried its own peril. As the Red Army reasserted control over Estonia in the autumn of 1944, Soviet authorities moved quickly to re-establish political dominance and eliminate any remnants of opposition. The Soviet reoccupation was not framed as a military conquest, but rather a liberation of Soviet territory. However, the measures taken on the ground revealed the true nature of the campaign: widespread purges, mass deportations, and the systematic dismantling of anything associated with the German occupation or Estonian nationalism. The NKVD, supported by Smersh counterintelligence units, launched sweeping operations across towns and rural areas to identify, arrest, and prosecute those deemed enemies of the Soviet state. This included anyone who had served in German auxiliary formations, regardless of whether they had volunteered, been conscripted, or performed non-combat roles. Service in the Estonian SS division, Schutzmannschaft, or even local administrative bodies became grounds for immediate detention. By early 1945, thousands of former volunteers who had remained behind were either executed, imprisoned, or exiled to labor camps in Siberia and the Urals. The Soviet regime made no distinction between ideological collaborators and reluctant conscripts. Reprisals extended to family members, with property confiscations and forced evictions affecting an even broader segment of society. According to official Soviet records, over 3,000 Estonians were arrested or deported between 1944 and 1949 for alleged collaboration or anti-Soviet activity. For those like the former SS NCO from Tartu County, returning home was not an option. His name, like many others, had been flagged in Soviet intelligence databases, and he was aware that capture would almost certainly result in death or long-term imprisonment. After withdrawing with his unit into Courland, western Latvia, he faced the same dilemma confronting thousands of Baltic volunteers: remain with retreating German forces as they became increasingly encircled, or attempt escape into exile. The Courland Pocket, formed in October 1944 when the Soviet 1st and 2nd Baltic Fronts isolated Army Group North, became a dead-end refuge for approximately 2,000 German troops, including the remnants of the Estonian division. Hitler refused repeated pleas to evacuate the pocket, insisting it be held as a strategic bastion. From a military standpoint, Courland had little value by this stage of the war, but for many Baltic soldiers, it offered a final stand on soil that was at least adjacent to their homeland. Throughout the winter of 1944-1945, Soviet forces launched multiple offensives against the Courland Pocket. Estonian troops, although exhausted and under-equipped, fought with determination. Their resistance was not so much for Germany as it was for survival, and perhaps, for some, a symbolic act of defiance against Soviet domination. German command awarded promotions and commendations to maintain morale, but supplies dwindled and casualties mounted. Medical treatment was primitive, food shortages were severe, and frostbite became a recurring affliction. The Estonian volunteer, now commanding a small platoon, led defensive operations in the forests near Saldus. His men included fellow Estonians, Latvians, and a few German regulars. Despite language barriers and differing motives, they shared a common fate. Letters from home ceased by early 1945, and rumors circulated of mass executions in Tallinn and Tartu. Some soldiers considered surrendering, hoping for leniency, but stories of NKVD brutality kept most in place. When Germany finally capitulated on the 8th of May 1945, the Courland Pocket was surrendered to the Red Army. Tens of thousands of soldiers laid down their arms, including approximately 12,000 Estonians. For them, captivity meant interrogation, filtration camps, and uncertain futures. Many were shipped to Gulag labor camps after brief trials, some sentenced for 10 to 25 years, others never heard from again. A small number were executed immediately. But the man from Tartu had already vanished. In the confusion of the final days of the pocket's collapse, he and several comrades fled westward on foot, avoiding main roads and checkpoints. Their goal was to reach the coast, where rumors suggested German naval vessels or fishing boats were evacuating survivors to Sweden. The journey was perilous, passing through Soviet-patrolled zones, abandoned villages, and flooded marshes. They relied on forged papers, bribery, and assistance from local sympathizers who had no love for the incoming Soviet regime. After weeks of hiding and movement under cover of darkness, the group reached the coast near Liepāja. By luck or design, they made contact with a former Kriegsmarine officer organizing clandestine evacuations. A fishing trawler, already loaded with refugees, agreed to take them aboard. In late May 1945, they crossed the Baltic Sea and reached Gotland, where Swedish authorities initially detained them for identification. Sweden, though officially neutral, had a complex relationship with Baltic refugees. Under Soviet pressure, the Swedish government had previously repatriated several hundred Baltic soldiers, an act later condemned as morally compromising. By mid-1945, however, public outcry and political changes led to a shift in policy. The Estonian escapees were granted asylum, though under close surveillance. Most were sent to refugee camps or work farms until their status could be verified. For the Estonian NCO, life in Sweden marked both a reprieve and a new exile. He changed his name, assumed a low profile, and took work in forestry and shipyards. Over time, he connected with Estonian émigré communities in Stockholm and Uppsala, many of whom shared his background, survivors of occupation, deportation, and war. Some had lost everything, others hoped to return, but few held illusions about Soviet rule in their homeland. Meanwhile, Soviet authorities issued international arrest warrants and propaganda broadcasts, branding such escapees as Nazi collaborators and enemies of the people. The man's photograph, along with hundreds of others, appeared in classified lists circulated among Warsaw Pact nations. Crossing into Soviet-aligned territory would have resulted in immediate arrest. In Estonia itself, the legacy of those who had served with the Germans was politically erased. Official history labeled them as traitors and fascists. Their families lived under suspicion, often barred from universities or employment in state institutions. The return of Soviet control brought with it a new wave of cultural repression, ideological indoctrination, and Russification. Only within the isolated circles of surviving partisans and underground nationalist groups did the memory of these volunteers persist, fragmented, dangerous to recall, and illegal to preserve. From 1945 to the early 1950s, the Soviet regime deepened its grip on Estonia through a combination of political restructuring, mass surveillance, forced collectivization, and cultural suppression. The NKVD and later the MGB, Ministry of State Security, intensified their campaigns to identify former members of German-aligned formations and nationalist resistance. Even the faintest links to the wartime Estonian SS division or auxiliary police units were grounds for imprisonment or execution. For those who had managed to escape, such as the former NCO now living in Sweden, the consequences extended to family left behind. In 1949, under the codename Operation Preboy, the Soviet regime launched one of the most sweeping deportations in Baltic history. Over 3 days in March, approximately 2,700 Estonians were forcibly removed from their homes and sent to Siberia, primarily to the Omsk and Tomsk oblasts. Among them were not only landowners and class enemies, but also relatives of suspected collaborators, partisans, or émigrés. The operation was meticulously planned and executed by thousands of MGB operatives and Red Army personnel, supported by informants embedded in nearly every village and town. Estonian society responded with despair, fear, and silence. Public protest was impossible, and even private criticism risked denunciation. The families of those who had joined the Waffen-SS, willingly or otherwise, were particularly vulnerable. Property was confiscated, children removed from schools, and spouses subjected to interrogation. The man who had fled to Sweden received word that his younger brother had been arrested and sent to the Komi ASSR for anti-Soviet activity. His father died during a forced winter relocation, and his mother was evicted from the family farm, which was absorbed into a state-run collective. Meanwhile, the Estonian émigré communities across Scandinavia and the West remained fragmented and politically cautious. While anti-communist sentiment was widespread, public sympathy for Baltic refugees was tempered by Cold War sensitivities. Western governments, particularly in the early post-war years, were reluctant to antagonize the Soviet Union by offering overt support to nationalist exiles with Waffen-SS connections, even when those connections were circumstantial or forced. In 1950, U.S. and British intelligence services began quietly debriefing Baltic émigrés for information on Soviet military deployments and local resistance networks. Some former Estonian volunteers were approached for potential recruitment into Western intelligence or psychological warfare operations. However, these efforts were limited and frequently compromised. Soviet counterintelligence maintained extensive networks within exile communities, and infiltration led to several compromised operations, including failed insertions of agents back into the Baltic states. The former Estonian NCO in Sweden was among those contacted by intermediaries from the British MI6-linked Operation Jungle, which attempted to insert trained agents into Soviet-occupied territories via sea routes and parachute drops between 1949 and 1955. While he expressed interest in aiding resistance efforts, he declined direct involvement, citing both the danger and the futility of action without international backing. His cautious decision likely saved his life, as many of the agents recruited through such programs were captured, tortured, or killed shortly after insertion. Back in Estonia, sporadic armed resistance continued in the form of the Forest Brothers, partisan fighters hiding in rural areas and conducting sabotage against Soviet targets. While initially numbering in the thousands across the Baltics, by the early 1950s their strength had dwindled due to attrition, betrayal, and the overwhelming firepower of Soviet security forces. The Soviet Ministry of Internal Affairs launched massive anti-partisan operations using armored units, aircraft, and psychological warfare to break remaining cells. In Estonia alone, over 1,500 partisans were killed between 1945 and 1955, and several thousand were arrested. The Soviet government offered amnesty in exchange for surrender, but few trusted the promises. Many partisans took their own lives when encircled, unwilling to face the torture and humiliation that awaited in NKVD prisons. In Tallinn, show trials were held for captured fighters, often resulting in the death sentences or transport to labor camps under Article 58 of the RSFSR Penal Code for counter-revolutionary activity. In rural areas, suspected sympathizers were blacklisted and subjected to forced relocations. Throughout these years, the story of the Estonian SS volunteers remained largely untold, silenced by fear and Soviet censorship. No monuments were allowed, no memoirs published, no oral histories collected. The regime's official narrative reduced the complex motivations of those who had served to a simplistic binary of fascist treachery versus Soviet heroism. Textbooks described the Estonian SS division as a tool of Nazi genocide, omitting the context of Soviet occupation, mass deportations, and forced conscription. Any attempt to complicate the narrative was considered a criminal act. Meanwhile, in Sweden, the exiled volunteer began writing down his experiences in secret. Using a coded system and pseudonyms, he filled dozens of notebooks with recollections of battles near Narva, life in the Courland pocket, and the betrayals that followed. His goal was not to glorify, but to preserve an account of events that he feared would be lost forever. He maintained correspondence with other exiles, gathering fragments of information about those who had vanished in Soviet prisons, or who had died in Siberian exile. By the late 1950s, he had married a fellow Estonian refugee and settled in a small coastal town north of Stockholm. His work was menial. He repaired engines in a boatyard, but his evenings were spent in careful reflection and transcription. Occasionally, younger Estonian exiles would seek him out, curious about what their parents never spoke of. He told them only what he thought they could bear, leaving the more harrowing details in his writings, intended for a time when it might be safe to speak freely. That time would not come soon. In Soviet Estonia, even into the 1960s, the shadow of the past lingered heavily. The security services remained active, and veterans of the German-aligned forces were monitored until death. Their names were absent from public records, their wartime graves unmarked or left to decay. But, despite official silence, private memory endured, in whispered conversations, in hidden photographs, in locked drawers and buried documents. The fragmented truth survived, waiting, like the man himself, for history to one day catch up. By the 1960s, Estonia was deeply integrated into the Soviet Union's political, economic, and cultural machinery. Heavy industrialization projects transformed the urban landscape, while Russian-speaking populations were resettled en masse into Tallinn, Narva, and Tartu, often outnumbering Estonians in key sectors. The ideological framework of Soviet historiography dictated that all narratives surrounding the Second World War adhere to the triumph of socialism and the liberation of fraternal republics from fascism. Within this tightly controlled information space, the complex and contradictory stories of those Estonians who had served in German formations were forcibly erased. Soviet censorship was total. Archives remained closed, and literature that did not conform to the official line was banned. Universities offered no serious inquiry into wartime collaboration or resistance beyond the narrow scope approved by Moscow. Films, books, and exhibitions portrayed the Estonian SS volunteers uniformly as traitors and Nazi tools. Their motivations, personal loss, anti-communist conviction, survival, ignored or vilified. Schoolchildren were taught a linear version of history that left no room for nuance, let alone dissent. But beyond the surface of Soviet conformity, memories endured in private. Among Estonian families who had suffered under both occupations, silence became a survival mechanism. Grandfathers who had worn German uniforms refused to speak of the war. Widows carried secrets to their graves. In some rural communities, graves of fallen volunteers were tended in secret, their headstones blank or marked with false names. The KGB monitored commemorative behavior closely, and even suspected acts of remembrance, lighting candles on certain dates, cleaning unmarked forest graves, could result in interrogation or harassment. Meanwhile, in Sweden, the man who had fled across the Baltic 20 years earlier continued his quiet life. His notebooks had grown into hundreds of pages of careful recollection, some factual, some reconstructed from memory, others pieced together from letters and news smuggled out of Soviet Estonia. He used no real names and made no attempt to publish. Western publishers were wary of anything that might be perceived as sympathetic to former SS members, even when the material was clearly historical in purpose. Still, he was not alone. Throughout Sweden, Canada, West Germany, and the United States, small circles of Estonian émigrés began to share testimonies, documents, and photographs. These informal archives formed the basis of a growing awareness among second-generation exiles that their parents' silence hid a far more complicated history. By the late 1960s, a few underground newsletters circulated in Estonian-language exile communities, discussing issues taboo in Soviet Estonia, the June deportations, the Forest Brothers, and the fate of the Estonian division. Some exiles attempted to testify publicly. A former company commander from the Estonian SS division gave a recorded interview to a Finnish radio journalist in 1968, sparking a diplomatic backlash from the Soviet embassy. The interview was never aired, but the transcript circulated informally. It described the Narva battles in military terms, emphasizing the defensive nature of the campaign and rejecting any association with Nazi ideology. Soviet authorities, predictably, labeled it fascist propaganda. In response to growing émigré activity, the Soviet Union increased pressure on Western governments to prosecute or extradite former collaborators. Several high-profile cases in Canada and the UK saw Baltic refugees investigated for alleged war crimes. In most cases, lack of evidence and political caution resulted in no charges, but the climate of suspicion contributed to further silence and discouraged broader historical inquiry. The man from Tartu kept his distance from public activism. He had no illusions about rehabilitation or recognition. Instead, he focused on translating portions of his writings into English, hoping that one day a neutral scholar might access them. He compiled maps, troop rosters, personal letters, and even fragments of German orders, all meticulously annotated. His goal was not justification, but documentation, to ensure that the role Estonians had played during the war, however controversial, was not lost to the distortions of totalitarian narratives. His own wartime experience, first under Soviet terror, then as a reluctant volunteer, then a fugitive in exile, had left deep psychological scars. He suffered from recurring nightmares of interrogation, of frozen forests, of the names of his comrades read aloud and marked for death. He trusted almost no one outside his immediate family, and he refused to allow photographs to be taken. Even when Estonia became a topic of international interest in the context of broader Cold War tensions, he declined invitations to speak publicly. Back in Soviet Estonia, the passing decades brought slow demographic shifts, but no political change. Russian became the language of administration and education in many areas. Local Communist Party officials, often imported from elsewhere in the USSR, showed little interest in Estonia's distinct history. The Stalinist period had passed, but its legacy of fear and silence persisted. Even among the children of deportees or former partisans, open discussion of the past remained rare. Yet beneath the surface, signs of cultural resistance emerged. Some Estonian writers began incorporating allegories of occupation and loss into fiction and poetry. Folk songs, once banned, were quietly sung again. In certain university circles, samizdat, underground publications, circulated translated works by Solzhenitsyn and other dissident authors. These acts, though small, signaled a growing undercurrent of historical awareness and quiet defiance. In the West, Cold War politics gradually began to recognize the plight of the Baltic states. U.S. and British policy continued to refuse de jure recognition of the Soviet annexation of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. In 1961, President Kennedy publicly affirmed this stance. Baltic émigré organizations lobbied the United Nations, wrote editorials, and held commemorative events. Still, these efforts had limited reach, and the dominant post-war narratives remained binary: Axis versus Allies, fascism versus communism, leaving little space for the stories of small nations trapped in between. By the end of the 1960s, the Estonian volunteer had begun drafting a final version of his memoirs. Unlike his earlier notebooks, this version avoided military detail and focused on the human toll, the choices forced upon young men, the families shattered by war and revenge, and the impossibility of moral clarity under occupation. He hoped, perhaps naively, that one day it could be published without fear. He stored the manuscript in a sealed envelope, hidden in the attic of his home, labeled only with a year, for Estonia when free. In the 1970s, the Soviet Union continued to suppress all attempts to revisit or recontextualize Estonia's wartime past. While post-Stalinist society grew more stable on the surface, it remained deeply coercive. The KGB's presence in Estonia was pervasive, maintaining a tight grip on political dissent and controlling every avenue of intellectual inquiry. Within this climate, the fates of those who had fought on the Eastern Front in German uniform, whether by choice or coercion, remained taboo, their identities erased or vilified within public discourse. The silence was enforced not only through institutional censorship, but also through fear that still hung heavy over survivors and their descendants. Many Estonians whose relatives had served in German-aligned units avoided even private discussion of the subject. Families concealed medals, photographs, or military documents in floorboards and barns, lest they be discovered during unannounced searches. Occasionally, local children playing in the forests stumbled upon rusted helmets, buried caches of weapons, or human remains, grim reminders of the battles fought and the men who vanished without recognition. Despite this atmosphere, isolated efforts at preserving the historical memory of the volunteers quietly persisted. In exile communities in Canada and the United States, small circles of Baltic historians began assembling oral testimonies, war diaries, and declassified intelligence reports. These collections remained unpublished for fear of political backlash, but they grew steadily. A handful of Western scholars took notice and began visiting exile circles in the 1970s, interviewing surviving Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian veterans about their experiences under dual occupations. The former NCO from Tartu, now well into his 50s, contributed to one such project through anonymous correspondence. Using a post office box and pseudonym, he mailed sections of his memoir to an American university that maintained an archive of Eastern European testimonies. In longhand Estonian, he detailed not just his military experiences, but also the moral compromises, the fear of capture, and the psychological toll of exile. He refused offers to be formally named in any publication, fearing repercussions for surviving relatives still in Estonia. During these years, he began attending discreet meetings of Estonian veterans in Stockholm. While the events were not publicly advertised, they served as spaces of cautious remembrance. Attendees shared wartime stories, exchanged news of others in exile, and held short commemorative services for fallen comrades. These gatherings offered no celebration of ideology or military valor. They were instead quiet affirmations of identity for men who had been forced to choose between evils and who now lived in moral purgatory, unacknowledged by history. At one such meeting, the man met a younger generation of Estonian Swedes who had grown up knowing little of the war beyond Soviet and Western textbooks. These descendants asked difficult questions. Why join the Germans? What did you witness? Could there have been another path? The older men, including the former NCO, struggled to answer. Some deflected, others offered careful justifications. But more often, they described a world of collapsing certainties, in which choices were made under duress, driven by survival, revenge, or the desperate desire to prevent a second Soviet occupation. Meanwhile, In Soviet Estonia, even quiet expressions of sympathy for wartime volunteers could result in consequences. University students who questioned the official version of the war risked expulsion or blacklisting. Teachers who mentioned deportations in anything but the approved language of counter-revolutionary suppression were reassigned or fired. Nevertheless, cracks began to form in the monolithic narrative. Some Estonian poets and writers began to explore the trauma of war and repression through allegory and metaphor. Though subject to censors, their works hinted at deeper historical wounds. A 1975 collection of short stories by an underground author described a nameless soldier walking through snowy forests, haunted by voices from the past, pursued by shadows that never spoke. Readers familiar with local history understood the subtext. The story was never officially published, but carbon copies circulated discreetly, passed from hand to hand. In exile, the former NCO continued his solitary work. He had grown gaunt, his health declining, but he remained lucid and dedicated to preserving the fragments of a buried past. His Swedish-born children spoke little Estonian and had no connection to the land their father still called home. To them, he was quiet and distant, prone to long silences and unexplained routines. Only later would they discover the folders hidden in the basement. Military orders, field maps, pages of scribbled memories, and faded photographs of men in SS uniforms, young faces marked by the certainty that they would never be celebrated. In 1979, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan sparked renewed scrutiny of the USSR's human rights record. Western media and academic institutions began taking greater interest in Baltic resistance and Soviet occupation. A small Estonian-language journal published in New York ran a serialized memoir by an anonymous Estonian soldier, fragments believed to be contributed by several veterans, including the man from Tartu. For the first time, his words were printed and read by a broader audience, though still behind pseudonyms and with heavy redaction to protect identities. One excerpt described the retreat from the Tannenberg Line. "We were not heroes. We dug into frozen ground with bare hands. We shot blindly through fog. We ran because to stay was to die. And when the tanks came, we prayed not for victory, but for an end." This tone, raw, unsentimental, stripped of ideology, resonated with readers far removed from the battlefields of 1944. For many younger Estonian exiles, it marked the first time they saw their family histories reflected in honest, if painful, prose. It was not redemption nor absolution, but it was recognition. And for the anonymous author, still living quietly in a coastal Swedish town, it was a sign that perhaps silence had not been in vain. In Soviet Estonia, no such recognition was possible. The 1980 Tallinn protests, sparked by cultural repression and economic stagnation, were quickly suppressed. But they signaled a rising undercurrent of national awakening, a generation that had grown up in the shadow of war and repression, but no longer accepted enforced silence. Among them were grandchildren of both Red Army veterans and SS volunteers, who shared experiences of secrecy, loss, and forbidden memory, would slowly, quietly begin to shape a new discourse. In the 1980s, as the Soviet Union began its slow and uneven descent into crisis, Estonia, like the other Baltic republics, experienced the first tangible signs of political and cultural thaw. The centralized Soviet system, once ruthlessly effective in controlling historical memory, was beginning to strain under the weight of its own contradictions. Economic stagnation, the war in Afghanistan, demographic tensions, and a growing generational divide all contributed to a widening gap between official ideology and lived reality. Into this opening emerged cautious but growing challenges to the imposed silence surrounding Estonia's wartime history. In this shifting environment, the former Estonian SS volunteer, still living in Sweden, watched events with both hope and unease. News reached émigré circles that underground nationalist groups in Estonia had begun distributing leaflets, holding secret meetings, and even staging minor protests, most famously the 1980 Letter of 40 Intellectuals, which decried the erosion of the Estonian language and culture. While the letter did not touch on wartime memory directly, it marked a cultural turning point. For the first time in decades, public figures within Estonia challenged Soviet authority in print. Around this time, the former NCO finalized his memoir manuscript. Unlike his earlier notebooks, which focused on operational detail and chronological precision, this version sought to capture the human dimension of the war, the disorientation of occupation, the impossible choices faced by young men, and the emotional toll of exile. He entrusted a copy to an Estonian historian in Canada, with instructions to publish it only after Estonian independence had been restored. Another copy he kept locked in a steel box under his bed, alongside his wartime identification papers and the last photograph of his family before the deportations. In Soviet Estonia, such material remained unpublishable, but the informal sharing of forbidden history intensified in private homes and academic circles. Oral traditions re-emerged, with elders recounting to younger generations, often behind closed curtains, the true reasons their uncles or grandparents had vanished after the war. In this environment, a quiet re-evaluation of wartime experience began to take root, especially among those who had never accepted the rigid dichotomy of fascism versus liberation that had dominated official doctrine. Among the younger generation in Estonia, there was growing curiosity about the war years. University students started questioning the origins of unmarked graves in the forests, the fate of missing relatives, and the truth behind contradictory family stories. Some began surreptitiously copying pages from foreign Estonian language publications, smuggled across the Baltic in fishing boats or hidden in diplomatic mail. Among these materials were excerpts from émigré memoirs, including those believed to have been written by veterans of the Estonian SS division. Though extremely risky, a few individuals in Estonia began attempting to reconstruct a more nuanced picture of the war. Amateur historians gathered stories from elderly villagers, photographed neglected burial sites, and mapped former battlefields near Narva and Voru. The state watched these activities closely. The KGB retained vast files on suspected nationalist sympathizers and frequently summoned individuals for conversations designed to intimidate and deter further action. Yet the sheer number of quiet inquiries and the resilience of cultural memory made complete suppression increasingly difficult. By 1985, the landscape began to change more rapidly with the ascension of Mikhail Gorbachev and the onset of perestroika and glasnost. While initially focused on economic reform, glasnost, openness, soon expanded into previously untouchable realms, including history. Soviet newspapers cautiously began printing pieces on Stalin's purges, the Gulag system, and wartime deportations. In Estonia, a local newspaper ran a subdued article acknowledging that the June 1941 deportations may have involved excesses. It was the first public mention of the tragedy since the end of the war. This limited opening prompted new interest in the stories that had long remained in the shadows. Former partisans who had survived imprisonment began speaking out, anonymously at first. A samizdat history of the Forest brothers circulated in Tallinn in 1987, using pseudonyms and disguised references, but clearly based on first-hand knowledge. Meanwhile, previously forbidden Western broadcasts from Radio Free Europe and Voice of America reached wider audiences, providing alternative perspectives on the war and its aftermath. The former SS volunteer in Sweden followed these developments through émigré newsletters and shortwave radio. He was now in his 70s, his health fragile, but his mind still sharp. For the first time in decades, he felt that the story he had preserved might one day be told without distortion. He contacted a new generation of Estonian activists abroad, young professionals and students born in exile, offering his documents and insight. They listened with respect, and though some struggled with the moral complexity of his wartime choices, they did not turn away. Among these younger exiles, the view of the Estonian SS volunteers began to shift. No longer seen solely as collaborators or nationalists, they were increasingly understood as participants in a tragic historical episode shaped by coercion, ideology, and survival. Some argued that while Nazi affiliation could never be exonerated, the motivations and context of individual volunteers had to be understood in light of Soviet terror and the absence of sovereignty. This more nuanced view did not celebrate or excuse, but but it sought to understand. In Estonia, the historical reawakening gathered pace. The first public commemorations of Soviet-era deportations were held in 1988 under the auspices of environmental and cultural organizations, legal fronts for rising nationalist sentiment. Monuments to deportation victims appeared in cemeteries and churchyards, often accompanied by informal memorials to those lost in war, a phrase that allowed families to honor fallen volunteers without invoking banned terminology. By 1989, as Glasnost continued to erode the monopoly on historical interpretation, an underground publication based in Tartu printed the names of hundreds of Estonian soldiers who had served in the Waffen-SS and died on the Eastern Front. The document was unadorned, no praise, no judgment, just names, dates, and places of death. It circulated rapidly, copied by hand and retyped on aging typewriters. For many families, it was the first acknowledgement in 4 decades that their sons, brothers, or fathers had existed beyond official erasure. That same year, the man in Sweden mailed his sealed manuscript to a university archive in Helsinki, marking it for public release after the restoration of Estonian independence. He included a simple cover letter. "I do not ask for honor or absolution. I ask only that someone remember we were there, and that we were not all the same." It was a statement that reflected both the weight of history and the quiet hope that time might someday bring understanding, where once there had only been silence. In 1990, as the Soviet Union teetered on the brink of disintegration, Estonia moved decisively toward reclaiming its independence. The Singing Revolution, a mass nonviolent protest movement rooted in national self-determination and cultural revival, had by now grown into an unstoppable force. The Estonian Popular Front and Congress of Estonia operated in parallel to the official Soviet government, with growing public legitimacy. The Supreme Soviet of the Estonian SSR declared a transition period toward full independence, and in March 1991, a nationwide referendum confirmed overwhelming support for sovereignty. The vote included exiled Estonians and émigré communities across the West, among them the former Waffen-SS volunteer in Sweden, who, after decades of silence, was finally able to send a letter to Tartu bearing his real name. For many Estonians, the collapse of Soviet power presented a long-awaited opportunity to confront the country's fractured historical legacy. It was a time of reckoning with uncomfortable truths, long-buried stories, and competing narratives about occupation, resistance, and survival. The return of free speech enabled families to speak openly for the first time about what had happened during the war years, not only under Soviet terror, but also during the German occupation. For those whose relatives had joined German units, the line between silence and shame began to blur, and with that came an urgent need to tell their side of the story. But this new freedom also brought conflict. Public discourse around the role of Estonian volunteers in German uniform quickly became a flashpoint. For some, these men were defenders of Estonian soil who had fought to prevent a second Soviet occupation. For others, they remained tainted by association with the Nazi war machine. The newly re-established Estonian government adopted a cautious stance. While it officially condemned both totalitarian regimes that had occupied the country, it also avoided direct recognition or glorification of Waffen-SS service, aware of the sensitive diplomatic implications and the fragile nature of the state's international image. Amid this tension, the first public memorials to the Estonian division began to appear. In small towns like Sinimäe and Varu, local residents erected modest granite slabs or wooden crosses marking the approximate sites of wartime graves. These monuments bore simple inscriptions. To the Estonian soldiers who fell here. The ambiguity was deliberate, honoring the dead without explicitly invoking the military units they had served in. The public response was mixed. Some placed flowers, others called it revisionism. International observers, particularly from Russia, accused Estonia of whitewashing fascism. Inside Estonia, the conversation was more nuanced. Many survivors and their families stepped forward to provide testimony. Among them were men who had fought at Narva, retreated through Courland, or spent years in Soviet camps for having once worn a German uniform. Their stories, shared in interviews, memoirs, or at veterans' reunions reflected the diversity of motivations and experiences, some driven by nationalism, others by coercion, others by the trauma of Soviet repression. These voices complicated the moral landscape of wartime memory, making it harder to reduce history to binaries. The former NCO from Tartu County, now in his 80s, watched the process unfold with quiet anticipation. In 1992, he finally returned to Estonia for the first time since 1944. The journey was emotional and disorienting. The town where he was born had changed beyond recognition, and few of his relatives had survived. His parents were long dead, his brother's grave unmarked, and the family home had been converted into a collective farm and later abandoned. Still, he found fragments of memory in the landscape: the river where he had fished as a boy, the hill where Soviet artillery had once shelled his platoon, the lane where NKVD trucks had taken his neighbors away. In Tallinn, he visited a private exhibition organized by a historical society devoted to documenting Estonia's experience under both occupations. The small room displayed uniforms, field gear, propaganda leaflets, and confiscated photographs, some showing young Estonian men in German helmets standing against the backdrop of burning towns. He recognized faces, even some he hadn't thought of in 50 years. A glass case contained a copy of his own division's field newsletter, and beside it, a map of the Narva front. For the first time, his war had been acknowledged in public, if not yet understood. In the years that followed, the former soldier became a contributor to Estonian memory projects. He gave recorded interviews, still under pseudonym, for the National Archive, recounting his wartime service and subsequent exile. He appeared once briefly in a televised roundtable discussion alongside a Soviet Red Army veteran and a deportation survivor. The exchange was careful but respectful. There were no accusations, only silence, measured words, and long pauses where meanings hung in the air. When asked whether he regretted his choices, he replied, "We chose the path that didn't end in chains, but the path itself was lined with graves." His memoir, previously sealed in an archive in Helsinki, was published in Estonian in 1995 under the title Between Two Occupations: Notes of a Volunteer. The book contained no photographs, no dedications, and no claims to heroism. It recounted with restrained prose and precise dates the trajectory of a man caught between two totalitarian empires, trying to survive with dignity and protect what little he could of his homeland. Though controversial, the work was praised by Estonian historians for its clarity, its refusal to simplify, and its contribution to restoring an erased chapter of national history. In the same year, the Estonian parliament passed a resolution recognizing the complex situation of Estonians who had served in foreign armies during World War II. The resolution did not exonerate or condemn, but it formally acknowledged that thousands had been forcibly mobilized by occupying powers and that their stories were part of Estonia's historical reality. This marked a subtle but important shift in state policy, from erasure to documentation, from judgment to understanding. Internationally, however, the debate continued. Russian media and politicians used Estonia's memorials and publications about the Waffen-SS as evidence of resurgent fascism. The accusations became a fixture of post-Soviet geopolitical rhetoric. Within Estonia, these charges were seen as cynical and hypocritical, given Russia's own unresolved legacy of Stalinist crimes. Nevertheless, the controversy shaped how the outside world viewed Estonia's historical discourse and often hindered open academic inquiry. Despite this, the effort to preserve personal testimony and historical documentation persisted. Veterans associations, archives, and independent publishers collected hundreds of interviews, letters, and artifacts. Estonian students wrote theses on the Narva front, on Forest Brother resistance, and on the political repression of returning soldiers. Some sought to trace family histories once obscured by fear or shame. For the first time, the names of Estonian volunteers were published not in secret lists or anonymous graves, but in academic publications, databases, and public memorials. For the man who had once fled across the Baltic in a fishing boat, these developments were both vindication and epilogue. He had outlived his commanders, his unit, and nearly all the men he had trained with. But he had also lived to see a world in which their names were spoken aloud, not only in accusation or defense, but in remembrance. In 1998, shortly before his death, he stood at a memorial stone near the Sinamäed Hills. No one recognized him. He touched the engraved dates, 1944, and then walked away without speaking. He left behind no estate, no monument, and no descendants to carry his name. But in the archives of a now free Estonia, in the footnotes of dissertations and the pages of oral histories, the story he had carried alone for half a century now belonged to many. And in that transfer, from silence to speech, from exile to return, there lay the quiet redemption of a life caught in history's cruelest fault line. In the decades following Estonia's regained independence, the nation continued to grapple with the complex legacy of the Second World War and the long shadow of occupation. The quiet man, who had once served as a volunteer under the Waffen-SS and survived Stalin's vengeance, had become one of many who, after years of exile and silence, were gradually reintegrated into a national narrative that had previously rejected their existence. Yet, even as Estonia matured as a democratic state, reconciling its past proved neither linear nor complete. Throughout the 2000s and into the 2010s, Estonian society engaged in an open and often painful dialogue about its 20th century history. Museums, research institutes, and university programs expanded to include both Soviet and German occupation periods in their curricula and exhibitions. A new generation of historians, freed from ideological constraints, published deeply researched monographs and biographies based on Soviet archives, émigré testimonies, and war diaries. These works provided the most balanced view yet of Estonian participation in wartime events, not as myth-making or accusation, but as critical reflection. Among the most significant efforts was the establishment of the Estonian Institute of Historical Memory, which worked to document the crimes of both occupying regimes. Its mandate included investigating the fates of Estonians deported by the Soviets, persecuted during the Nazi occupation, and later repressed after 1944. The Institute collected and digitized thousands of personal accounts, many of which contained previously unspoken stories of those who had joined German military formations, not out of ideological allegiance, but from coercion, survival instinct, or a desperate hope for national defense. Public memory evolved unevenly. Each passing year brought new discoveries and revised perspectives. In some communities, former Estonian SS volunteers began to be recognized not as heroes, but as historical actors whose lives had been defined by impossible circumstances. Memorial services became more open, and while controversial, they were increasingly attended by younger Estonians who wished to understand rather than judge. Documentaries aired on national television, interviews were given without masks or pseudonyms, and academic conferences invited international scholars to examine Estonia's wartime experience without political filters. Yet not all voices accepted this growing openness. In Russia, where the state increasingly instrumentalized the memory of the Great Patriotic War for political legitimacy, Estonia's efforts to re-examine its past were portrayed as revisionist and anti-Soviet. Each year on May 9th, Russian media criticized Baltic states for glorifying fascism and rewriting history, pointing specifically to commemorations of Estonian veterans who had fought under German command. This international pressure remained a source of diplomatic tension and hindered regional historical reconciliation. Within Estonia, generational shifts changed the tone of debate, while older citizens retained deeply personal attachments to wartime memories. Either through family experience or personal trauma, many younger Estonians approach the subject academically, recognizing the need to preserve historical truth in its full complexity. University seminars, school curricula, and public exhibitions began to emphasize the dual occupation narrative, that Estonia had been occupied not once, but twice, and that the choices made by its citizens during those years were shaped by external domination and internal fragmentation. The former SS volunteer's memoir, Between Two Occupations, became a case study in several academic courses. Historians praised its restraint and refusal to justify or glorify, and students often expressed surprise at its human tone. far from the propaganda-laden documents of the past. His personal archive, now housed in the Estonian National Library, became one of the most consulted resources on the Estonian division, cited in dozens of theses and doctoral dissertations. A biography, published in 2016, reconstructed his life from archival fragments, correspondence, and the recollections of those who had briefly known him in exile. In 2020, on the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, Estonia held a nationally broadcast panel titled Choices in a Shattered State. The program featured historians, descendants of deportees, former Red Army conscripts, and grandchildren of Waffen-SS volunteers. It did not aim for reconciliation, but understanding. One panelist remarked, "We inherited a history that was never given to us in full. We were asked to choose between myths, but our job now is to carry the truth forward. Uncomfortable, complicated, but ours." The legacy of the Estonian volunteers remains contested. Their memory exists not as a monument to glory, but as a cautionary tale of what happens when small nations are drawn into the wars of empires. In Estonian literature, films, and museums, their presence is increasingly acknowledged, not to justify, but to recognize. Monuments now stand at Narva and Sinamäed, flanked by memorials to Soviet and civilian victims alike. Annual commemorations are held quietly, with both pride and grief, by descendants who seek not to revive the past, but to ensure it is not forgotten. From exile and obscurity, the story of the man from Tartu County has come full circle. His name, once hidden in a sealed envelope and whispered only in trust, is now part of Estonia's historical record. He is not celebrated nor condemned. His life is not taught as a model, but as a window into the fate of thousands like him. Individuals who moved through history's deadliest storm with limited choices and no safe ground to stand on. And so, what remains? A gravestone in Sweden, etched with his name and the years of his life, stands in a quiet cemetery near the coast. Nearby, a laminated copy of his wartime photograph is occasionally placed by visitors, young Estonians from abroad, who read his memoir and felt for the first time that they had heard the war not as an anthem, but as a testimony. The photograph fades with time, the ink bleeds under moisture, but the story, once silenced, buried, and nearly lost, now lives in the voices of a free people searching for understanding in the ruins of an unspoken century. In the end, the Estonian volunteer who survived Stalin's revenge did not live to see his country fully come to terms with its past. But he did live long enough to witness the first stirrings of remembrance, the return of truth to public light, and the slow, careful reconstruction of memory from the ashes of repression and war. His survival, once a matter of chance, became instead a testimony to endurance. And in that endurance, Estonia found one of its many paths back to itself.